Hello everyone. Welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, Primordial White Testarossa unveiled her powerful hidden ability, Nihilistic World, with the sole purpose of forcing out the mysterious presence lurking in the shadows behind Guy and Velzard's battlefield. In this episode, Guy would join Velgrynd and Testarossa's discussion, while Rain and Misery would make their entrance onto the battlefield. Meanwhile, an unspoken rivalry between Moss and Rain would also unexpectedly unfold. Additionally, the battle's progression would also be examined from Guy's perspective. So, let's get started. Both Velgrynd and Testarossa had sensed a concealed force watching from the darkness, yet Velgrynd admitted that there was only so much she could do at the moment. One of her parallel existences was still stationed within Heaven Tower, where Melim, under Feldway's control, had unleashed Drago Nova. Fortunately, the star barrier she had cast, combined with the tower's inherent durability, had minimized the damage. For those who had forgotten about Velgrind's star barrier, Episode 113 provided a detailed recap. However, the crisis was far from over. Velgrynd intended to conserve her remaining strength, as the gateway connecting Star Palace and Heaven Tower had already been opened, signaling an imminent large-scale invasion by Evarage and the Cryptid's army. Beyond that, the entire world was still engulfed in chaos. Velgrynd noted that Melim and Feldway were currently advancing towards Sarian, with their likely target being the Divine Tree. Unable to prevent this herself, she could only rely on the forces stationed there. At present, Sarian's defensive lineup consisted of Veldora, Leon, Zelario, Sylvia, and Elmesia. Velgrynd flashed a stunning smile, as if acknowledging her own predicament. In episode 117, Luminous had declared the Doomsday Declaration, prompting heroes and warriors from across the world to gather at the border between Rubrios and Damargania. Among them, Emperor Masayuki stood as a representative, making it Velgrind's top priority to provide support and protect the one she loved. In truth, large armies positioned too far from the battlefield would require Velgrind's spatial connection to arrive in time, which meant that Guy's battlefield control could only be entrusted to Testarossa. Testarossa found herself troubled, now fully convinced that an unknown and mysterious force was operating behind Velzard. If Guy and Velzard escalated into a full-scale battle, the impact on the planet would only become more severe. Although Velgrind's barrier was still holding, preparations for countermeasures could not be neglected. Furthermore, uncovering the hidden entity lurking in the shadows, potentially influencing the battle, posed an immense challenge. Just as she was contemplating her next steps, an unexpected thought communication reached her. It was none other than Primordial Red Guy. Despite being at the heart of the battlefield, where thick magicule-infused blizzards raged, Guy had effortlessly established the thought communication, an unmistakable testament to his overwhelming power. Velgrynd teasingly accused Guy of eavesdropping, while Testarossa remarked on how leisurely he seemed. Guy, in his usual arrogant manner, completely ignored their remarks and stated that he, too, had sensed a hidden force behind Velzard and had been observing the situation. However, before Evarage's arrival, a resolution needed to be reached. Testarossa, amused by his tone, sarcastically inquired what exactly he meant, to which Guy responded by comparing her to Rimuru, calling her just as lazy and urging her to get to work. Testarossa let out a dry laugh. Being compared to her revered master, Rimuru-sama, felt like a compliment, but being labeled as lazy was far less pleasant. Besides, she firmly believed that her master was merely overwhelmed with responsibilities, not neglecting his duties. As for Guy's request, Testarossa found it troublesome. Naturally, since she only obeyed Rimuru-sama, she instinctively disregarded Guy's command. Unfazed, Guy continued, stating that he would have Misery and Rain take over maintaining the protective barrier and instructed Moss to assist them. Unlike his master, Moss lacked the confidence to ignore Guy and immediately complied. Velgrynd, finding no issue with the plan, casually entrusted the barrier to Moss and, without hesitation, dispelled her parallel existence. Within seconds, the residual energy of Velgrynd connected to a dimensional rift, a portal emerged, and Rain and Misery arrived on the battlefield. With their arrival, the white-dominated battlefield transitioned into a new phase. The moment Rain set foot on the scene, she wasted no time complaining, whining about the unbearable cold, remarking that even a primordial demon like herself was on the verge of freezing. Her complete disregard for the situation was entirely in character. However, this time, Testarossa was present, a figure far less indulgent than Misery. Shooting Rain a cold glare, she ordered her to shut up and focus on the task at hand. Had Misery been the only one present, Rain might have managed to slack off, but with Testarossa watching, she had no choice but to begrudgingly get serious, reinforcing Moss's barrier with long overdue diligence. Feeling the strength of Moss's barrier, Rain couldn't help but comment that perhaps Moss was actually stronger than her. Moss, not wanting to get dragged into a pointless discussion, immediately brushed off the remark, insisting that she must be joking. However, Rain was not someone who would let such a statement slide so easily. She observed that the defensive barrier seemed capable of withstanding nearly any attack. In reality, Moss had designed the barrier primarily to protect himself and Salka, making its durability remarkably high. It was strong enough to completely neutralize the aftershocks generated by Guy and Velzard's battle. Moss humbly stated that his only goal was survival. Rain retorted that none of her own subordinates could manage something of this caliber, and even Misery admitted that Khan, her assistant, another demon peer like Moss, was nowhere near Moss's level. While being praised would typically be a source of pride, Moss knew better than to let his guard down. He had long been aware that Rain's specialty was using flattery to manipulate others into doing the tedious work for her. Determined to take the initiative, Moss swiftly moved to delegate tasks. He announced that he had successfully linked his defensive barrier to the protective field Velgrynd-sama had established in the area. With that done, he declared that the primary control should now be transferred to Rain-sama, with Misery-sama overseeing the adjustments. Among demons, hierarchy was absolute. Making a direct request to two primordial demons, both of whom outranked Moss himself, was practically suicidal under normal circumstances. However, the urgency of the situation and the fact that this course of action aligned with Testarossa's strategic plan led Moss to take a bold gamble, one he hoped would be tolerated. To his relief, his judgment was correct. Misery acknowledged Moss's decisiveness and readily agreed. In the next instant, Moss felt an immense burden lift from his shoulders. With Misery's intervention, the overwhelming strain he had been enduring, the feeling of desperately holding on to a tightly pulled rein, vanished. Meanwhile, Rain, though complaining that she found it unacceptable for her to be forced into such a tiresome role while Misery was relegated to mere support, nonetheless took over Moss's defensive barrier. Even for someone as skilled in magical manipulation as Moss, witnessing Rain seamlessly assume control over his highly intricate barrier in an instant was nothing short of astonishing. Moss couldn't help but be awed by Rain's capabilities. As Rain had speculated, if they were to engage in a direct battle, Moss might actually have a slight advantage over Rain. Though Moss had never tested this theory, he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. Given enough preparation and a meticulously crafted strategy, Moss believed he could secure victory. After all, his trump card, Infinite Eater, ensured absolute elimination of an opponent as long as their magical reserves did not exceed his own. Of course, this required the opponent to remain within range and not escape, meaning precise timing was crucial. Since Rain and Misery had similar magical reserves to Moss, Moss considered his reasoning sound. However, this was a fundamental miscalculation. Even if he employed Infinite Eater, Moss realized it would likely have no effect on Rain. He had completely underestimated the gap between himself and a primordial demon. The realization struck him like a heavy weight, deepening his respect for the 7 primordial demons. At the same time, he recognized his own arrogance. Determined never to let overconfidence cloud his judgment again, Moss resolved to remain cautious and to constantly remind himself of the overwhelming difference in power that separated them. That being said, Rain was completely shaken on her end as well. She was utterly stunned to realize that Moss's magical reserves actually surpassed her own. Though the difference was minuscule, Moss did indeed have the numerical advantage. The remark Rain had made earlier, joking that Moss might actually be stronger than her, turned out to be only half a joke. There had been a genuine sense of concern behind it. As mentioned before, Rain had once challenged Testarossa back when the latter was still an archdemon, only to suffer a humiliating defeat that left her in tears. Though Rain had forcibly erased that disgraceful memory from her conscious mind, she had never been able to shake off the uncomfortable feeling it left behind. And now, to make matters worse, even Testarossa's subordinate had seemingly surpassed her. For Rain, this was an absolute affront to her pride, an insult of the highest order. This time, Rain was completely serious. With uncharacteristic determination, she seized full control of the defensive barrier from Moss, treating the situation as a battle to reclaim her dignity. To her, this was no longer a mere exercise in magical precision. It was a war to defend her own sense of self-worth. Moss had assumed that taking the initiative would give him the upper hand, but Rain had played the same game. In contrast to Moss's lack of battle-hardened instincts, Rain displayed her overwhelming superiority in real combat. Ultimately, she managed to safeguard her pride, and as a result, the overall situation improved significantly. Misery, observing from the sidelines, was filled with admiration. Moss's strength was certainly impressive, but what truly captivated her was the rare sight of Rain demonstrating her full magical prowess. It was a display she had not seen in a long time, and she found herself momentarily speechless, utterly entranced. Her affection for Rain was unmistakable. She sincerely believed that if Rain consistently applied herself like this, Gi-sama would undoubtedly entrust her with even greater responsibilities. However, from Rain's perspective, this was nothing but an unnecessary burden. The very idea of being Gi's favored subordinate filled her with dread, as it would inevitably lead to more work. Unlike those who sought power or influence, Rain was a demon who lived purely by her own whims. She despised responsibilities that were forced upon her, believing that work should be done only to the extent necessary to sustain a comfortable life. Anything beyond that was, in her opinion, a waste of her talents. Rain did not even require sustenance to survive, and whenever she faced difficulties, she could always rely on Misery and her apostles of green to resolve them for her. Furthermore, Misery's excessive indulgence only fueled Rain's laziness. It was precisely because of Misery's relentless spoiling that Rain had grown so willful and idle. Yet Misery herself remained blissfully unaware of this flaw. Instead, she continued to dote on Rain with great satisfaction, never realizing that she was, in fact, enabling her partner's irresponsibility. At present, however, Misery had been thoroughly inspired by Rain's unexpected diligence. Fueled by this rare display of effort, she threw herself wholeheartedly into refining the magical flow within the defensive barrier. She meticulously combed through every possible weak point, strengthening and optimizing the field to ensure flawless protection. As a result, the residual vulnerabilities left behind by Velgrind's departure had become virtually negligible. Seeing this development, Testarossa was more than satisfied. With Salka's safety now fully secured and all concerns eliminated, Testarossa shifted her full attention toward the mysterious entity lurking in the shadows. Let us now shift our perspective to Gi. Before Gi arrived at the scene, this vast, white world had already plunged into a deathly silence. Velzard's magic had frozen everything. Theoretically, if she were to withdraw her power, the frozen realm would naturally return to its original state, restoring all that had been sealed. This led Gi to suspect that Velzard's true intentions were not aligned with Feldway's. However, no matter how he tried to persuade her, Velzard remained unmoved. Her lips curled into a cryptic smile as an overwhelming barrage of attacks surged toward Gi. What appeared to be a playful exchange on the surface concealed an extreme level of danger. Though Gi had yet to unleash his full power, he was forced to respond with caution. Their battle was a constant exchange of probing strikes, each escalating in intensity. Occasionally, an attack would be aimed directly at a critical weak point, yet both combatants saw through these feints effortlessly. Even the most formidable observers would struggle to distinguish between a mere probe and a genuine lethal strike, underscoring the unfathomable heights to which both had ascended. Moreover, despite the prolonged confrontation, neither Guy nor Velzard showed any signs of fatigue. As a true dragon, second only to Veldanava, Velzard possessed the ability to generate magicule infinitely within her own body, rendering conventional attrition tactics ineffective. However, achieving such a state required specific conditions, which was precisely why Velzard had frozen everything in her frozen world, the Eternal Domain. Within this domain, magicule cycled perpetually, and because her replenishment rate exceeded her consumption rate, she effectively achieved an endless supply of magicule. If it were Velgrynd, a continuous bombardment of high-output abilities would eventually lead to exhaustion. However, for Velzard, such tactics were utterly meaningless. Guy fully understood this. Even among the true dragons, Velzard was an anomaly. To contend with her, he had no choice but to minimize his own consumption to the absolute limit. Guy opted not to rely on his own reserves of magicule but instead drew energy directly from the surrounding space to cast his spells. This method, though slow and inefficient, ensured that his overall consumption remained stable for an extended battle. However, such a strategy had little effect on Velzard, whose resistances were so overwhelmingly high that most magic had no impact on her whatsoever. Even so, Guy persisted, using minimal effort to extract as much information as possible, reserving his true magic-consuming techniques for a decisive moment. Yet, before long, Guy noticed something unusual about the battle. Despite the psychological warfare he was waging, Velzard never once fully committed to an all-out offensive. She, too, remained in a state of constant probing. Guy had initially assumed this battle would be different from their past encounters, but Velzard's patience exceeded his expectations. While she was known to wield the Lord of Patience, in reality, she had always been willful and unpredictable, hardly the type to embody true patience. Back when they had clashed in the past, it was precisely her impatience, her frustration with Guy refusing to act according to her expectations, that had led her to rush toward victory recklessly, resulting in costly mistakes. Because Guy understood Velzard's temperament so well, he had initially planned to employ the same strategy as before, baiting her into a trap. However, this time, Velzard displayed no openings. The ice and snow imbued with her magic effortlessly dismantled every trap Guy had set. Guy had believed that he had grown significantly stronger, yet he had not anticipated Velzard's immense progress as well. The composure she now exhibited was almost unrecognizable. Her magic extended across the entire battlefield, the blizzards consuming everything, steadily eroding the world with her overwhelming power. However, what truly put Guy on high alert was not just the magnitude of Velzard's abilities but also the shift in her combat style. She was no longer relying solely on her overwhelming raw strength. Her tactics had become far more refined. Rather than simply being astonished at her growth, Guy was more inclined to suspect that an external influence was at play. While he did not believe that Velzard was under direct control, he remained vigilant, proceeding with the assumption that a hidden force was manipulating events from the shadows. His suspicions soon proved correct. Even in the midst of his battle, Guy detected the arrival of Testarossa and the others, quickly grasping the evolving situation. Though he remained uncertain about Rimura's current status, the emergence of Ivaraj had undoubtedly escalated the conflict to its worst possible outcome. However, it was not all bad news. Thanks to Testarossa's decisive actions, the existence of a hidden force behind Velzard had been confirmed. Moreover, Testarossa was precisely the right person to deal with such a mysterious adversary. Guy held very few individuals in high regard, but Testarossa was unquestionably one of them. Without hesitation, he made his decision to intervene in Testarossa and Velgrind's discussion and to summon rain and misery from Golden City El Dorado to reinforce the battlefield. As a result, the overwhelming instability of Velzard's domain began to settle, bringing a momentary sense of relief to Guy. He acknowledged Testarossa's efforts with rare praise, and for the first time in quite a while, he also found himself genuinely satisfied with the contributions of rain and misery. Alright, that's all for this video. When comparing the strengths of Rain and Moss, I personally believe that neither of them would be able to completely overpower the other. While Infinite Eater cannot kill Rain, Rain still lacks a truly decisive finishing move, at least for now. I doubt the author would ever introduce or reveal Rain's strongest move. Of course, Rain's popularity among fans has nothing to do with her actual combat strength. As things stand, it seems that among all the primordial demons, Rain fears Testarossa the most. In our next episode, we will uncover the process by which Velzard acquired Lord of Endy, and the hidden figure behind the scenes will finally make an appearance: the divine ancestor Twilight Valentine. To be honest, I never expected this character to appear at all. Naturally, the next episode will be even more exciting. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.